Welcome, Chosen One.
Hey guys, welcome to the Ace of Plays channel, and to a type of video I haven't done in quite a while. This is going to be a deck guide for my Ardal Assimilate list that I can proudly call my own creation, and it's been doing really well for me, and it's definitely a hell of a lot of fun. So this is just going to be the guide. There's not going to be any gameplay in this video, but there will be a separate video released alongside this one, and there should be a card right here, and a link down below to take you to that video. So if you just want to see gameplay, just click on through. 3 games in a row with this deck. But if you do want a more in-depth explanation before you go check out the gameplay, stay right here and we're going to go over this deck card by card, and I will explain why these cards are included in this deck, their importance, and then we're going to go over some matchups and all that good stuff. So yeah, let us jump straight into the deck. So first of all, the leader, Ardal Oebdahi. Why Ardal? This deck can probably function just as well with Anna Henrietta or Jan Calvate, who are more commonly played alongside Assimilate. But I like Ardal because this is a heavy engine deck, and we play Operator, which we'll get back to. And playing Ardal alongside Operator in an engine deck just allows us to get 2 extra copies of one of our core engines. This deck in particular, I feel like that's a very strong combo because of how useless our engines are to most opponents. And yeah, like it's perfectly safe to give them a copy of it because they can't do shit with it, while we can gain mad stacks of points. So that's why I like Ardal. He's also very flexible. You can steal your opponent's units. You can steal a Flying Redanian, a Bersodi brother, a bunch of stuff from Syndicate. And yeah, it's a flexible leader, powerful effect, and it can help us set up engines. Like we have a surefire way to ensure some good Ardal value. So we're going to start at the top. Portal, one of my favorite cards in the game. As we've learned from Henselt, Portal in an engine deck, if you can play it, you should play it. And we definitely can't play it. We have Ducal Guard and Nausicaa Sergeant as our 4 provision units, and they're both engines, assimilate and deploy based, that synergize with a lot of the cards in our deck. And yeah, they will just... Portal lets us set up 2 of these engines at once, and that often can be enough to really start slamming those points later in the round, and steal the round, and potentially the whole game. Triss Telekinesis. This, I think, is a really good card in this deck because, first of all, it creates a card from outside your starting deck, so it triggers all Assimilate. But with the bronze special cards we have in this deck, there are 2 main ways that we want to use this. If you have a lot of Assimilate on the board, you can use it for an Imperial Diplomacy. You know, you just create and play a bronze card from your opponent's faction. Sometimes this is really good, other times it's not as good. But if you have a lot of Assimilate on the board, then creating this and then using this to create something else, that's a double Assimilate trigger. That's a lot of value from this card right here. And I think Triss Telekinesis is one of the more fun cards in the deck, and I really appreciate this card. Alright, so we have Operator. Even if you don't want to play Ardal, you should still play Operator in this deck because it allows you to spawn a copy of one of your engines on your side and your opponent's side. Now, if you take one of our Assimilate engines, unless you're in an Assimilate mirror match, your opponent will most likely have no use for it, whereas you get a lot of use of it. So even if you can't steal it with Ardal, even if you don't play Ardal, it's still pretty good. We also have ways to set it up for just stealing with spheres, so you can save Ardal. I guess very good. And it synergizes really well with Duchess's Informant, because you give your opponent a copy of your core engine, and then you use this card potentially 3 times, potentially 4 times if you feel so inclined, to spawn and play a copy of it. So you can get a lot of copies of your core engines. Like I've had like 6 Ducal Guards, I think, at once, and Imperial Diviners, just 6 at once, and they're all triggering every round, every turn. It's really awesome. Operator is definitely worth it in this deck. I mentioned Spheres. This is just a high value card. You can steal your opponent's engines, you can set up like a lot of different cards for Steel with Spheres. This card in particular has nothing to do with this list, so this is a flexible spot. Other cards that I've considered for this are Roach, if you feel like you need more thinning and tempo. You could also run Carl Avarese for just a high damage control card. This deck has practically no control, so if you want to add a little bit of that, this is a very high value card to do with. And if you're running into a lot of tall units, which a lot of the tier 1 decks at the moment are running, I have played Leo Bonhart for a little bit in this, and it's worked out fine. So those are the main cards I would consider. Yeah. A card I have been thinking about is Stefan Scallon, because if you pull it off and you play like a Bribery, then you spawn a copy of Bribery from outside your starting deck, so you trigger Assimilate, and then you play Bribery, which triggers Assimilate again, and you might get a really high value card. So that could be a fun thing to try. But I haven't tried it yet. I don't have the balls. Next up is Hengate's Sword. This is one of my favorite cards again. Our main use is to replay Roderick, who is a 2-strength spy, who lets us look at 2 random goals from our deck and then play one. And then you replay him with Hengate's Sword, you create a new copy of it from outside your starting deck, triggers Assimilate, and you get, you know, to fetch another gold card from your deck. If you don't get Roderick, you can also use it with Cantarella, or in emergencies, Duchess's Informant. But of course, your opponent will also be able to play some cards that you can set up for this. We don't have many ways to set up, but we have a good bit, so you should be able to get solid value from this. But Hengate and Roderick, if you have them both in round 1, don't be scared to use them. The thinning is really good, and winning round 1 can be very, very important in certain matchups. So, yeah, these are cards, if you have them both in your hand in round 1, then you're safe to use them. Next up is Artorias Vigo. I'm pretty sure I mentioned this card a little bit. He's an Assimilate engine with a deployability that creates a card that triggers Assimilate. He creates a 1 power copy of a bronze unit from your starting deck. So obviously the best card to get is Informant, because it's already 1 strength. It'll trigger double Assimilate and just get you a lot of value. Now, if I've done my math correctly, there's a 78% chance of getting this as one of the options. Otherwise, you're not really in that good of a spot. Like you can create another engine, which, you know, is good on paper, but it's 1 strength, so it can be killed very easily. Often you might just go for the pikeman because it gets an additional point immediately. Often, but if you don't get Informant and you're already in a rough spot in the round, then you might be a little bit screwed. But if your opponent doesn't have a lot of control and you're safe to play one of these Assimilate engines, then it might just be worth it. But all in all, I think this is a good card. And beautiful, beautiful piggies. Next up is Bribery. This is one of the tactics that we use for Ardal. You just create and play a unit from your opponent's starting deck. You can get a 4 provision unit, you can get Old Spear Tip. Like, the variance of this card is fairly high. But it's very, very matchup dependent. Like, we'll get back to this in the matchup section of this guide, but like against Skellige, you can get so many good cards. Even their bronzes are decent with this. But then against Scoia'tael, you can get a Dwarven Agitator. Of course, you get 3 options, and the 2 other ones should always be better than Dwarven Agitator for you. So, but yeah, you can get like 3 4 provision units if you're unlucky. But you can high roll. It triggers Assimilate. It's a tactic, so it's just a solid card for us to put in here. Now, Scepter of Storms is a card you might not often see in any decks, let alone an Ardal Assimilate list. This is just like a personal pick. You do not have to run this, but I think it's really cool. Like, it's fairly easy to get value from this. And that's 8 for 8 value. And the weather you spawn from this triggers Assimilate, so it's an 8 for 8 that triggers Assimilate. I think it's really good. It helps us set up spheres. It can help us set up Hengate's Sword. So I really think it's actually a pretty good card to include here. But I mean, it's a personal pick. It's a very personal card for me to put in this. But if you like the idea of this, then you should definitely try it. It's been doing like very, very decently, like consistent 8 for 8 value, and it triggers Assimilate. And it helps us set up some of our cards that have requirements that we normally maybe can struggle to fulfill. Roderick, we already talked about. Great thinning card. Synergizes really well with Hengate Sword. And it's just awesome. Cantarella as well. It's another Spy. It plays the top card from your opponent's deck, so it's disruptive. It triggers Assimilate. It's fairly cheap. Like, sometimes you can get bullshit cards from this, but that's the risk you take when playing this deck. Like, that's why Assimilate is there, to help make up for the variance and give you some extra power, even though you might get a Dwarven Agitator with this. If you can't tell, I'm very salty about getting a Dwarven Agitator, which you will see in the gameplay video. Lacerate is one of the newer additions to this deck. We run Alba Pikeman, which often makes people row stack heavily. And Lacerate in general, even without any row stack setup, can often get very decent value, and it's a good round 1 finisher. It's a good secondary option for Triss Telekinesis if Imperial Diplomacy is not going to cut it. It's just a good card, and we do have Alba Pikemans. Sometimes, if you're not doing too hot on the Assimilate front, like your hand does not support Assimilate a whole lot, I have had games where like I operator a Pikeman, then I copy it with an Informant, and then I steal it back, and you just have an army of Pikemen. So your opponent will row stack like completely, and then Lacerate can get up to 18 value on a full board. And we do play Spies, so we can set up like 2, 3, 4 extra points by ourselves. And of course, if you don't intend on Ardalling your Operator Diviner, then you can just play it into a row you want to Lacerate, and you get an extra 2 points from it. So that's actually... Lacerate has done really well for me. I really enjoyed this addition to the deck. Dazbog Runestone. Now this particular slot is also a little bit flexible, much like Suir's. This is like a high rolly card. It triggers Assimilate. Sometimes you get shitty cards, sometimes you get better cards. It creates from your faction, so like you can get Assimilate engines, you can get Imperial Diplomacy. Yeah. You can low roll, you can high roll, but it triggers Assimilate. What you could do is change it out for Experimental Remedy. I considered this, but I went with the Runestone because you're more flexible to use it in round 1, whereas Remedy requires setup. And that's basically it. And of course, you gotta keep in mind, if you play Runestone, that's a gold, so that dilutes Roderick's pool. But this is a bronze and will dilute Triss Telekinesis' pool. So that's just up to you. Personal preference. If you don't mind the setup and you don't mind diluting Triss Telekinesis, then you can play Remedy. You have more control over this card, but like I said, it requires more setup. But if you want to play Runestone like me, then you play Runestone like me. Like, they both trigger Assimilate, and they're both have high variance in what you be able to get. This could get an Informant, and that's why this card is probably good. But like I said, I like the flexibility. A lot of these cards, I feel, in the past, I've struggled to play round 1 because I wanted to save so many of them for round 3. So I just wanted something that I could play safely in round 1. So that's why I go for Runestone, but Remedy is also pretty good. Imperial Diplomacy, I'm pretty sure we talked about this. This is very matchup dependent. It depends on the faction you're playing against. It takes from the entire faction, not just your opponent's deck. So the variance is going to be high. Against something like Skellige, you can get a lot of good stuff with this, but you can also low roll pretty hard against Skellige. But yeah, it triggers Assimilate, and it's a tactic. And it's decently